"Sir, do not eat that." The words cut through the ballroom so abruptly that the music seemed to disappear for a second. Conversations stopped. Crystal glasses froze halfway to waiting lips. More than 300 guests turned toward the head table beneath the glow of enormous chandeliers. At the center of the room, billionaire Preston Calloway sat beside his fiancée, Evelyn Mercer, moments away from making what everyone believed would be the most celebrated announcement of the year. The engagement reception occupied the grand ballroom of the Callaway Plaza Hotel in downtown Chicago, a room filled with CEOs, politicians, investors, and media personalities. A string quartet played near the stage. White roses covered every table. Giant windows overlooked the city skyline sparkling against the night sky. Yet none of that mattered now. Every eye was fixed on the black woman standing beside the serving station. Zora Bennett had not intended to become the center of attention. She wore a simple black professional uniform reserved for consultants working behind the scenes. She was supposed to remain invisible. Instead, she had just interrupted one of the most powerful men in the room as he lifted a fork toward the specially prepared appetizer placed before him. Preston lowered the fork slowly. Surprise crossed his face. Evelyn stared at Zora as if she could not believe what she had heard. Several guests exchanged confused looks. One man laughed nervously. Another whispered something to the woman beside him. Zora felt hundreds of eyes studying her at once, but she did not step back. Her heartbeat quickened. Her palms felt warm. Still, she remained where she was. Something about the dish placed before Preston had immediately caught her attention only moments earlier. It was not obvious. Most people would never have noticed. But Zora was not most people. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Sometimes the most important decisions begin with a single sentence spoken at exactly the right moment. The silence stretched. Preston looked from the plate to Zora. "Is there a problem?" he asked calmly. Around him, guests leaned forward. The question hung in the air. Zora knew how this looked. She knew she had interrupted a private celebration in front of influential people who expected perfection. She also knew she could lose her contract before the night was over. Yet remaining silent had never been an option. "I believe there may be an issue with that dish," she answered carefully. Murmurs immediately spread through the ballroom. Evelyn's expression hardened. "An issue," she repeated. The smile she wore for photographers only minutes earlier disappeared. This menu was approved by some of the best culinary professionals in the country. A few guests nodded. Others looked at Zora with open skepticism. To them, she appeared to be a staff member overstepping her place. The orchestra remained silent. Waiters stood frozen beside tables. Even the photographers seemed uncertain whether to keep shooting. Zora could feel the weight of judgment settling across the room. Yet beneath that pressure, another feeling remained stronger. Concern. Genuine concern. Because something she had seen in the preparation area 20 minutes earlier refused to leave her mind. Near the back of the ballroom, city lights reflected against the glass walls overlooking Chicago. Inside, the ballroom remained trapped in uneasy silence. Preston Calloway glanced once more at the untouched appetizer before setting his fork completely aside. Around him, guests exchanged whispers that spread from table to table like ripples across water. The interruption had shattered the carefully orchestrated rhythm of the evening. At the center of the tension stood Zora Bennett. She could feel the skepticism in the room. She had experienced it before. People often made assumptions the moment they saw her. They saw a black woman in a service uniform and decided they already knew everything worth knowing. What they never saw was the expertise behind the uniform. What they never asked was why she had been hired in the first place. Earlier that afternoon, while the ballroom was still empty and staff rushed through final preparations, Zora had walked through every section of the catering operation. That was her job. For more than 12 years, she had worked as a food safety and risk management consultant for major events across the country. Corporate conferences, luxury hotels, professional sports venues, and charity galas regularly hired her team to identify problems before they became disasters. Most guests never noticed people like Zora, because success in her profession meant nothing went wrong. She preferred it that way. Recognition was never the goal. Prevention was. Yet as she stood beneath the gaze of hundreds of wealthy strangers, she realized none of them knew any of that. Evelyn certainly did not. The billionaire's fiancé sat perfectly composed beside Preston, but the frustration in her eyes had become impossible to hide. "I am sure there is an explanation," she said with a practiced smile. "But perhaps concerns like this should be handled privately rather than in front of our guests." Several people nodded in agreement. The statement sounded reasonable. It also shifted attention away from the actual concern and toward the person raising it. Zora recognized the tactic immediately. The room began viewing her as the disruption rather than considering what she had observed. Near the stage, members of the event staff looked increasingly nervous. Some avoided eye contact entirely. Others watched Zora with concern, knowing exactly how quickly a consultant could become a convenient scapegoat if an evening went off schedule. Preston, however, remained unusually calm. Instead of dismissing her outright, he studied her carefully. "What exactly concerns you?" he asked. The question surprised many people. Zora noticed it too. Most executives in Preston's position would have brushed aside an unexpected warning. Yet he seemed genuinely interested in hearing the answer. She chose her words carefully. Something during preparation did not match the documentation provided to the safety team. The statement immediately generated another wave of whispers. It was technical enough to sound serious but vague enough to avoid public accusations. Evelyn crossed her arms. "You are suggesting there is an issue with our catering staff?" "I am suggesting the dish should be verified before anyone consumes it," Zora replied. Her voice remained calm. The contrast between her composure and the growing tension around her only made people more curious. Near the back of the ballroom, a catering manager suddenly appeared, speaking urgently with another staff member. Zora noticed the exchange. So did Preston. Whatever was happening, it had started moving beyond a simple disagreement. The lights from downtown Chicago shimmered through the towering windows while uncertainty spread across the room. Guests who had arrived expecting an elegant engagement célèbre. Evelyn Mercer had spent the last year becoming one of the most admired women in Chicago's social circles. Every magazine profile described her as elegant, intelligent, and charitable. Photographers loved her. Charity boards welcomed her. Business leaders praised her ability to navigate rooms filled with powerful people. To most guests gathered inside the ballroom that evening, she appeared to be the perfect future partner for Preston Calloway. As the founder of one of the largest technology companies in the country, Preston attracted constant public attention. Yet even among billionaires he was known for being cautious. Friends often joked that he trusted financial reports more than people. The fact that he had chosen Evelyn convinced many that she must be exceptional. The giant screens positioned around the ballroom displayed photographs from their relationship. Images from charity events, international trips, and community projects rotated beside smiling headlines celebrating their engagement. Guests applauded each time a new photo appeared. The evening had been designed to showcase a modern fairy tale built on success, generosity, and public admiration. Yet standing beneath the soft golden light of the chandeliers, Zora noticed something unusual. The more people praised Evelyn, the more carefully Evelyn monitored the room. It was subtle. Most guests would never have noticed it. While everyone else focused on appearances, Zora's profession had trained her to pay attention to details. Small inconsistencies often revealed larger problems. Earlier that afternoon, while conducting her routine inspections, she had witnessed a brief exchange in a restricted preparation area. A catering supervisor had attempted to ask a question about a last-minute change to a dish scheduled for Preston's table. The answer came not from the executive chef, but from someone who should not have been involved in food preparation decisions at all: Evelyn. At the time, the interaction seemed odd but not necessarily alarming. Wealthy clients frequently requested menu adjustments. Still, something about the conversation lingered in Zora's mind. The catering supervisor appeared uncomfortable. Evelyn appeared unusually determined. Then there was the paperwork. One document submitted to the safety team listed an ingredient substitution that did not appear on the final kitchen production sheet. It was a small discrepancy, only a few lines on a form, but discrepancies mattered. That was why Zora had noticed it immediately. Across the ballroom, guests continued whispering about the interruption. Some viewed Zora as an unnecessary complication. Others appeared entertained by the unfolding drama. Near the front tables, Several investors quietly speculated about whether Preston would dismiss her before the night ended. Their assumptions revealed how little they understood the situation. Preston remained seated, his untouched plate still resting before him. The billionaire's attention never drifted far from Zora. Something about her confidence challenged his expectations. Most people became nervous when confronted by public pressure. Instead, she seemed focused entirely on the issue itself. Evelyn noticed his interest. The realization clearly bothered her. She leaned closer to him and spoke softly. Although most guests could not hear the words, they could see her reassuring smile. Preston listened politely but did not immediately respond. His eyes shifted toward the catering staff once again. Near the ballroom entrance, 2 hotel managers had joined the growing cluster of employees engaged in urgent conversation. Whatever investigation had begun was no longer confined to the kitchen. The atmosphere continued changing. Excitement gave way to uncertainty. Uncertainty gave way to suspicion. Outside the towering windows, Chicago's skyline glittered beneath the night sky. Inside, beneath the beauty and elegance of the engagement celebration, invisible cracks were beginning to appear. And while the room still saw Evelyn as the flawless future wife and Zora as the inconvenient outsider who interrupted a perfect evening, the truth was already moving quietly through the corridors behind the ballroom, growing larger with every passing minute. The tension inside the ballroom became impossible to ignore. What had begun as a brief interruption now dominated every conversation in the room. Guests who had arrived expecting an evening of celebration found themselves watching staff members move quickly between the ballroom, the kitchen, and the management offices. The orchestra remained silent. Servers stood near the walls waiting for instructions. Even the photographers appeared uncertain whether to continue documenting the event. At the center of it all stood Zora Bennett. She wished she were anywhere else. Her profession was built on preventing problems, not becoming part of them. Yet as she watched hotel managers and catering supervisors review documents near the ballroom entrance, she knew remaining silent would have been far worse. Preston Calloway rose slowly from his seat and approached the group reviewing the records. The room immediately grew quieter. People noticed whenever a billionaire moved with purpose. Hotel executives straightened their posture. Catering managers suddenly looked even more nervous. Preston accepted several pages from one of the supervisors and began reading. His expression remained calm, but his focus sharpened. He was no longer viewing the situation as an inconvenience. He was treating it as a legitimate concern. Evelyn noticed the shift immediately. For the first time that evening, uncertainty flickered across her face. She approached Preston with her usual graceful confidence and placed a hand gently on his arm. "This has gone far enough," she said softly. "A misunderstanding should not overshadow the entire evening." Several guests nearby nodded. The statement sounded reasonable. It also increased the pressure on Preston to move forward and restore normalcy. Yet Preston did not immediately agree. Instead, he turned another page and asked a question that made the catering supervisor visibly uncomfortable. "Why does this ingredient report not match the preparation log?" The supervisor swallowed hard before answering. "That is what we are trying to determine, sir." More whispers spread through the room. Zora remained near the service area, watching carefully. The answer confirmed her concerns. Documentation errors happened, but multiple discrepancies involving the same dish were far less common. Across the ballroom, many guests continued assuming she had simply gotten lucky. They believed she noticed a clerical mistake and nothing more. What they did not understand was that Zora had spent years recognizing patterns most people overlooked. Her instincts were built on experience, not coincidence. Near the stage, one of the executive chefs arrived carrying additional paperwork. He handed the documents to hotel management before quietly explaining something. The reaction was immediate. 2 managers exchanged alarmed looks. Another made a phone call and hurried toward the kitchen. Preston noticed every detail. So did Evelyn. The difference was how each responded. Preston appeared increasingly determined to understand the truth. Evelyn appeared increasingly eager for the discussion to end. The contrast was subtle but growing harder to ignore. Outside the massive windows, the lights of Chicago reflected against Lake Michigan while dark clouds drifted across the night sky. Inside, the atmosphere felt heavier with every passing minute. Guests no longer discussed the engagement. They discussed the investigation. Investors whispered theories. Socialites exchanged speculation. Journalists attending the reception discreetly checked their phones, sensing a story developing before their eyes. Then a hotel executive approached Preston carrying a sealed folder. His expression was serious. Very serious. He spoke quietly, but several nearby guests noticed the color leave his face as he listened. Preston opened the folder and reviewed the contents in silence. The ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Whatever information had just arrived was important. When Preston finally looked up, his gaze moved across the room until it settled on Zora. For a brief moment neither spoke. Then the billionaire gave us. The ballroom that had once felt elegant and celebratory now felt divided. On one side stood the guests who believed the investigation should continue. On the other stood those who wished the entire situation would disappear before it damaged the evening. At the center of that divide stood Zora Bennett. The attention made her uncomfortable. She had not interrupted Preston's dinner to become part of the story. She had spoken because something felt wrong. Yet as more information emerged, many people seemed determined to blame her for the disruption itself. Evelyn Mercer understood that instinct better than anyone. The moment she sensed public opinion beginning to shift, she moved quickly to regain control of the room. She stepped toward the center of the ballroom with practiced elegance, offering guests the same polished smile that had charmed them all evening. "I think everyone can agree this has become unnecessarily dramatic," she said. Several people nodded immediately. Others appeared relieved to hear someone finally challenge the growing uncertainty. Evelyn continued, "We invited friends, family, and colleagues here to celebrate a joyful occasion. Instead, one accusation has turned the entire evening upside down." Her words were carefully chosen. She never directly attacked Zora. She did not need to. The implication did the work for her. Around the room, guests began glancing toward Zora again. Some expressions carried sympathy. Others carried suspicion. One investor quietly shook his head. A woman seated near the front whispered something to her husband that caused both of them to look toward the service area. Zora recognized the pattern. The conversation was no longer focused on the discrepancy. It was focused on the person who had revealed it. Preston noticed the shift as well. His expression darkened slightly, but he remained silent. He was still reviewing information contained within the folder provided by hotel management. Whatever he was reading clearly demanded his full attention. Evelyn interpreted his silence as an opportunity. "Perhaps some people are simply trying to prove how important they are," she said gently. A few nervous laughs emerged from nearby tables. The words landed exactly where she intended. Zora felt dozens of eyes settle upon her once more. For the first time all evening, genuine frustration stirred inside her. Not because she was being criticized. She had endured worse. What frustrated her was watching concern for safety become secondary to appearances. Still, she refused to respond emotionally. "I gain nothing from this," she said calmly. Her voice was not loud, yet the room quieted to hear it. "My responsibility is to report concerns when I find them." Evelyn crossed her arms. "And if those concerns are wrong?" The question lingered. Several guests waited for an answer. Zora met her gaze. "Then I accept the consequences." The confidence in her response surprised the room. She did not sound defensive. She sounded certain. That certainty created a new kind of discomfort. Because certainty often comes from knowledge. Near the ballroom entrance, a senior hotel executive suddenly appeared accompanied by the head of catering and two members of the legal compliance team. Their arrival immediately drew attention. People stopped whispering. Even Evelyn fell silent. The group moved directly toward Preston. One of the compliance officers handed him another document. This time, Preston read only the first page before looking up sharply. His eyes shifted toward the preparation area, then toward Evelyn. The movement lasted only a second, but Zora noticed it. So did several people standing nearby. A subtle change passed through the room. It was impossible to define, yet everyone felt it. The assumptions that had protected Evelyn all evening were beginning to weaken. Meanwhile, the assumptions surrounding Zora were beginning to crumble. The city lights outside continued glowing beyond the massive windows, while tension settled over every table. Nobody cared about the engagement announcement anymore. Nobody cared about the music or decorations. The evening had become something else entirely. And as Preston slowly closed the folder and rose from his chair once again, it became clear that the next revelation would not merely validate Zora's warning. It would force the entire ballroom to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the people standing before them. The ballroom slowly emptied as guests drifted into smaller groups, each conversation carrying the same mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. Preston had disappeared with hotel executives, legal advisors, and members of the catering management team nearly 20 minutes earlier. No announcement had been made. No explanation had been offered. The absence of information only intensified the speculation. Some guests believed the issue had already been resolved. Others suspected something much larger was happening behind closed doors. Zora Bennett stood alone in a quiet service corridor just beyond the ballroom doors. The sounds of the celebration reached her only as distant echoes now. Soft music filtered through the walls. Glasses clinked somewhere far away. Laughter appeared briefly before fading again. Under the cool fluorescent lights of the hallway, the glamour of the evening felt very distant. For the first time since she interrupted the dinner service, Zora allowed herself a slow breath. She leaned lightly against the wall and closed her eyes for a moment. The exhaustion was beginning to catch up with her. She replayed the evening in her mind. The warning, the stares, the whispers, the accusations. She knew there was a real possibility her contract would be terminated regardless of what happened next. Organizations often preferred convenient solutions over uncomfortable truths. If powerful people felt embarrassed, someone usually paid the price. Often that someone was not the person responsible for the problem. The thought did not frighten her as much as it once might have. Experience had taught her that integrity occasionally came with consequences. She simply wished the evening had unfolded differently. Nearby, a service cart stood abandoned beside a storage room door. Beyond a narrow window at the end of the corridor, the lights of downtown Chicago shimmered against the dark sky. The city looked peaceful from a distance. Inside the hotel, however, tension continued building. A junior hotel manager emerged from a conference room further down the hallway. He noticed Zora and hesitated. For a brief moment it looked as though he wanted to say something. Instead, he offered a small nod before continuing toward the ballroom. That reaction told her more than words could have. Something significant had been discovered. A few minutes later, another employee hurried past carrying folders and printed reports. Then another. The pace of activity behind the scenes was increasing rather than slowing. Whatever investigation had begun was expanding. Zora folded her arms and looked through the window again. She thought about the catering supervisor who had seemed uncomfortable earlier. She thought about the altered documentation. Most of all, she thought about Evelyn. Throughout the evening, the future bride had appeared far more concerned about ending the discussion than understanding the concern itself. The detail continued bothering her. Not because it proved anything, because it raised questions. Questions that now appeared to be spreading through the hotel management team as well. The hallway remained quiet. No cameras, no guests, no judgmental stares. Just the soft hum of ventilation and the distant pulse of ballroom music. For the first time all evening, Zora felt completely alone. Yet strangely, she also felt at peace. She had done what her profession required. She had spoken when remaining silent would have been easier. Whatever happened next was no longer within her control. At the far end of the corridor, the conference room door finally opened. Several executives stepped out. Their expressions were serious. Behind them came Preston Calloway. The billionaire moved more slowly than before, carrying a folder beneath one arm. He stopped briefly when he noticed Zora standing by the window. For a moment neither spoke. Then Preston gave a thoughtful nod before continuing down the corridor. There was something different in his expression now. Not suspicion. Not uncertainty. Recognition. As he disappeared toward the ballroom, Zora understood one thing with complete certainty. The answers had been found. The only question remaining was whether the truth would be revealed publicly. And judging by the look on Preston's face, the next few minutes were about to change the entire evening forever. When Zora followed Preston back into the ballroom, the atmosphere felt entirely different from the one she had left behind. The music had stopped again. Conversations had faded into nervous whispers. Guests stood rather than sat, forming small clusters throughout the room while watching the main stage with growing anticipation. Whatever had been discovered behind closed doors had clearly reached at least part of the crowd. People could sense it. The uncertainty hanging over the evening was no longer curiosity. It was expectation. Preston walked directly toward the stage carrying the folder he had taken from the investigation team. Hotel executives followed several steps behind. Legal advisors remained near the front tables. Even members of the catering staff had gathered quietly along the perimeter of the ballroom. Their expressions were tense. Evelyn stood near the center of the room waiting for Preston's return. At first she smiled, clearly expecting him to reassure everyone and restore the evening to normal. But the moment she saw his face, the smile disappeared. Preston looked calm. Yet beneath that calm sat a level of disappointment that was impossible to miss. The room gradually fell silent as he stepped onto the stage. Hundreds of eyes followed him. Crystal chandeliers reflected above the crowd, while the city skyline glowed through the towering windows beyond. Preston placed the folder on the podium and looked across the room. No one spoke. "Thank you all for your patience," he began. His voice was steady, professional, controlled. Several concerns raised earlier this evening required immediate review. Guests exchanged glances. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned forward to hear every word. Preston continued. "The review has now been completed." A wave of tension moved through the ballroom. Near the back of the room, Zora stood quietly beside the service entrance. She had no desire to be the center of attention. Yet she could feel people glancing toward her. Many of the same guests who had dismissed her warning now seemed eager to learn whether she had been right. Preston opened the folder. The discrepancy identified by our food safety consultant was legitimate. The room reacted instantly. Some guests gasped. Others stared toward Zora in disbelief. A few lowered their eyes altogether. The statement carried enormous weight. It meant she had not overreacted. She had not imagined the problem. She had acted exactly as her professional responsibility required. Preston allowed the reaction to settle before continuing. The investigation confirmed unauthorized changes were made to preparation instructions and documentation associated with my meal. Silence returned. This time it felt heavier. Evelyn remained motionless. Her expression revealed nothing. Yet several people standing closest to her noticed her hands tighten slightly. Preston looked down briefly before turning another page. Those changes were not made by kitchen staff. More whispers erupted. Hotel executives exchanged grim expressions. The implications were becoming impossible to ignore. Preston raised his eyes toward the audience once more. Additional findings uncovered a pattern of concealed communications, undocumented requests, and financial activity connected to those instructions. The room seemed to stop breathing. Even guests who knew nothing about food safety understood what that meant. This was no longer about a menu discrepancy. It was about trust. Preston's gaze slowly shifted toward Evelyn. Hundreds of people followed his eyes. For the first time all evening, she appeared genuinely unsettled. "I asked for complete transparency," Preston said quietly. "The findings I received tonight revealed information that was intentionally withheld from me." The words landed harder than any accusation. No shouting. No drama. Just facts. Guests looked from Preston to Evelyn and back again. The perfect image that had dominated the evening was beginning to crack. Near the service entrance, Zora watched in silence. She had not uncovered every detail. She had not conducted the investigation. She had simply recognized the first sign that something was wrong and refused to ignore it. Yet that single decision had set everything else in motion. Around the ballroom, people slowly realized the same thing. The woman they had underestimated had been the first person to see the truth. And as Preston prepared to reveal the final piece of what investigators had discovered, the entire room understood that the evening would never return to what it had been before. The silence that followed Preston's statement felt heavier than anything that had happened earlier in the evening. No music played. No glasses clinked. Even the city lights beyond the ballroom windows seemed distant now. Hundreds of guests stood frozen as they waited for the final pieces of the story to emerge. Preston remained at the podium, one hand resting lightly on the folder that had transformed the entire event. His expression carried none of the anger many expected. Instead, it reflected disappointment, the kind that comes when trust breaks in a way that cannot easily be repaired. Evelyn stood near the front of the room, surrounded by people who only an hour earlier had celebrated her future. Now those same individuals watched her with uncertainty. Some appeared confused, others looked shocked. A few quietly stepped back, creating a subtle distance around her. Preston took a slow breath. The investigation revealed that several financial disclosures connected to recent business proposals were never presented to me. Murmurs spread immediately. The statement alone was enough to change the atmosphere. Transparency mattered in Preston's world. Trust mattered even more. Additional communications were intentionally concealed, he continued. Those communications involved individuals who stood to benefit from decisions I believed were being made independently. Around the ballroom, guests exchanged stunned looks. No dramatic accusation was necessary. The facts spoke for themselves. Hotel executives remained silent. Legal advisors stood with folded arms. The findings had already been reviewed and verified. Across the room, Zora watched quietly from her place near the service entrance. She felt no satisfaction, no triumph. If anything, she felt sadness. Because despite everything that had happened, she understood that revelations like these carried consequences for many people. Relationships, reputations, futures. Preston looked toward Evelyn. You had opportunities to explain these matters. His voice remained calm. Instead, you chose not to. For the first time all evening, Evelyn seemed unable to find the perfect response. The confidence that had defined her public image had disappeared. She glanced around the room and found no easy escape from the reality surrounding her. Eventually, she lowered her eyes. The gesture alone told guests everything they needed to know. No one celebrated. No one applauded. The room simply absorbed the truth. After several long seconds, Preston closed the folder. This engagement will not move forward. A collective breath swept through the ballroom. Some people closed their eyes. Others stared at the floor. The announcement felt inevitable, yet hearing it spoken aloud carried enormous weight. Evelyn nodded once. Slowly, quietly. Then she turned and walked toward a side exit without another word. No one followed her. The grand image displayed throughout the evening had finally collapsed beneath the weight of reality. For a moment, the ballroom remained completely silent. Then something unexpected happened. Preston stepped away from the podium and walked directly toward Zora. The crowd parted instinctively. Every guest watched. Every camera followed. When he reached her, he stopped. You protected more than my health tonight, he said. His voice carried clearly through the room. You protected me from making decisions without the information I deserved to have. Zora looked genuinely uncomfortable being placed at the center of attention again. I only did my job, she replied. Preston smiled faintly. Most people would have remained silent. Around them, guests reflected on that truth. Many remembered how quickly they had dismissed her, how easily they had questioned her motives, how eagerly they had judged her without knowing anything about her qualifications or character. The realization settled heavily across the ballroom. One by one, people began approaching Zora. Some offered thanks. Others offered apologies. Several simply shook her hand. Through it all, she remained exactly the same person she had been at the beginning of the evening. Calm, professional, grounded. The room around her had changed completely. She had not. And as the final conversations of the night unfolded beneath the glow of the chandeliers, the lesson became impossible to ignore. The person with the least power in the room had been the one with the courage to speak when everyone else chose comfort over truth. By the time midnight approached, the ballroom barely resembled the place it had been a few hours earlier. The orchestra had quietly packed away their instruments. Many guests had already departed. The enormous floral arrangements remained untouched, and the crystal chandeliers still cast warm reflections across the polished floors, but the energy had changed completely. The excitement of celebration had given way to reflection. Small groups stood together speaking softly about everything they had witnessed. Some discussed business. Some discussed trust. Most discussed Zora Bennett. The woman who had arrived as an unnoticed consultant had become the person nobody could stop talking about. Yet Zora seemed entirely unaware of the impression she had left behind. She spent the remainder of the evening completing reports, speaking with hotel management, and answering a handful of procedural questions from the compliance team. While others viewed the night as extraordinary, she continued treating it as part of her responsibility. That quiet professionalism impressed people even more than the revelation itself. Near the front entrance, several guests approached her before leaving. Some thanked her personally. Others apologized for assumptions they now regretted. A few admitted they had initially dismissed her warning because they judged her appearance before considering her expertise. Zora accepted every conversation with grace. She did not lecture anyone. She did not revisit the insults or skepticism. She simply listened. Across the lobby, Preston Calloway stood beside one of the towering windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Beyond the glass, city lights stretched toward the horizon while reflections shimmered across the river below. He watched the departing guests for several moments before turning toward the ballroom one final time. The evening had exposed more than hidden information. It had exposed character. Some people had chosen convenience over truth. Others had chosen courage despite personal risk. The difference was impossible to ignore now. Eventually Preston crossed the room and found Zora preparing to leave. She had exchanged her event credentials for a coat and shoulder bag. There was nothing dramatic about her departure. No cameras, no speeches, no public ceremony, just a professional finishing her workday. "I wanted to thank you once more," Preston said. Zora smiled politely. "You already did. Not enough." He glanced toward the nearly empty ballroom behind them. Most people in that room were worried about protecting an evening. You were worried about protecting people. The statement lingered between them. Zora looked through the glass doors toward the quiet Chicago streets outside. "Sometimes doing the right thing is uncomfortable," she said. "That does not make it optional." Preston nodded slowly. The simplicity of the answer seemed to affect him more than any speech could have. They stood together in silence for a moment. Not an awkward silence. A thoughtful one. The kind that follows a lesson nobody expected to learn. Finally Zora wished him well and stepped toward the entrance. The hotel doors opened. Cool night air drifted inside. Outside, the pavement reflected the glow of streetlights after a light evening rain. Traffic moved steadily through the city. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn echoed before fading into the darkness. Zora walked away without looking back. Her pace remained steady. Her posture remained confident. She carried herself exactly as she had at the beginning of the evening. The world around her had changed. She had not. Preston remained near the entrance watching her disappear into the city lights. Behind him, hotel staff quietly cleared tables and folded linens. The celebration that had once seemed so important was over. Yet the most meaningful part of the night had never been the engagement, the decorations, or the guest list. It had been a single decision made by a person willing to speak when silence would have been easier. As the doors slowly closed and the sounds of the city softened beyond the glass, the final lesson of the evening settled quietly into place. True character is revealed when there is nothing to gain from doing what is right. True courage often arrives without recognition. And sometimes the person everyone overlooks becomes the very person who changes everything.